Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Danielle Gauthier, Senior Product Marketing Manager at Dragos. Welcome to our OT Cybersecurity Year in Review Lessons Learned from the Frontlines webinar. We'll be sharing insights on what our professional services team has learned firsthand while working to help our customers secure electric, manufacturing, oil and gas, and industrial organizations across the globe. We have a lot to cover today, and we're very pleased you could join us. But before we get started, this session is being recorded and the recording will be emailed to everyone after the session. Also, your microphones have been muted, but we still want to interact with you. So please use the Q&A chat feature to submit any questions you have, and we'll try to get to your questions at the end. And so for today's agenda, first, we'll do some brief introductions from our panel of experts from the professional services team. Then we'll share insights from our year in review aligned with the SANS 5 ICS Cybersecurity Critical Controls, an ICS Incident Response Plan, Defensible Architecture, ICS Network Visibility and Monitoring, Secure Remote Access, and Risk-Based Vulnerability Management. Then we'll cover case studies from the front lines of OT cyber defense. And now let's meet our panel of experts.
Thank you, Danielle. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. My name is Jackson Evans-Davies. I am a Director of Professional Services here at Dragos. I have over 15 years OT experience, started off as a consultant, made my way to Director recently, and I have a specialized in OT network penetration testing, so that's near and dear to my heart.
Hello, I'm Hussain Virani. I am a senior industrial incident responder. I've been doing incident response for approximately 9 years, and I have been specializing in OT response for just over 2 years at Dragos.
Hi, my name's Eddie. I spent about 20 years in industrial settings, starting off as an ME in a plant, moving on to building industrial control systems, and finally shifted to OT cybersecurity for the past 10 years or so, including pen testing, consulting, and some other design work. In the context of this year in review that we'll be talking about today, I had a lot to do with some of the data analysis and numbers that we'll be looking through. Marissa?
Hey everyone, my name is Marissa. I am a senior industrial penetration tester here at Dragos. I help the Dragos penetration testing team perform our offensive assessments like network penetration tests and device penetration tests, as well as network vulnerability assessments and some of our other offerings like OT compromise assessments and architecture reviews.
Right on. So today, as Danielle said, we're going to set a focus on discussing year in review trends that we had based on the ICS 5 critical controls. Throughout 2023, Dragos completed a combination of assessments, as Marissa mentioned, architecture reviews, compromise assessments, tabletop exercises, whether they were custom, standard, executive, and penetration tests, application, network, and device. What we were able to do is take all that information, formulate some numbers, put it all together, create the year in review report, but also use that to be able to help guide and educate where the services team has identified findings in environments and how we can help best guide clients through their security roadmap. The focus today, again, will be built on this SANS ICS critical controls, a white paper that SANS and Dragos put together last year to be able to identify, common areas where asset owners and operators can use to be able to build out their security practice. Now, it's important to be able to understand that these 5 should be followed in order for the best approach to the environment. And the first one that we'll talk about today is ICS Incident Response Plan. Now, it's important when we talk about an incident response plan that we design and develop an OT-specific plan for the environment, right? We talk with a lot of customers that say, we ask them, do you have an OT incident response plan? They'll say, well, no, we have an IT one that we can likely copy to the OT environment. And while some of that translation might work from IT assets into OT assets, a lot of them don't. We able to have PLCs, HMIs, RTUs all within that environment. It's important for us to be able to understand how all that communication works together and be able to understand that. Another thing with an incident response plan is to be able to actively test it and make sure it's up to date and make sure we run through real life experiences. And that's important when we develop these plans and test them on a regular basis. Now, the number on the right-hand side that's associated with each of the 5 controls represent the percentage of reports that we submitted to our clients last year in 2023 that have, a lack of incident response plan or areas where we can focus on making it better. So in this case, it was 38% of the reports that we send out across all those services that we identified where incident response plan could be, a little more fine-tuned. The second point that we will discuss a little bit more in detail and go over avenues is defensible architecture. Now, defensible architecture is a very wide conversation. It's important for defensible architecture to be able to identify a framework. There's a lot of frameworks out there where organizations can take the information and build their security model around that. It's important for everyone to choose which one fits their vertical the best. But then from that, be able to identify proper communication paths, from the IT environment down into the DMZ and then ultimately into the OT space. Now, when we talk about defensible architecture, a lot of folks think, right away, network segmentation. How can I separate my environment into security zones, security networks, to be able to, limit communication where needed? We also talk a lot about domain segmentation. What does that mean in an environment, right? We talk about domain trusts. Is that a one-way trust? Is it unidirectional? Is it bidirectional? Is it a two-way trust? And really, what's the impact of that trust in your environment? Do you understand, or do folks understand what that implementation could be used for? And again, the percentage of our reports, we identified that 46 of our reports had some kind of finding or communications that identified that defensible architecture could be improved. And these numbers might seem high, but it's important for us to, as consultants, to identify them and work with the client to be able to move them along that roadmap. And again, going down the list, we've done incident response plan, defensible architecture. Now we can move on to network visibility and monitoring. This is really important to do after your architecture has been defined, has been set. Your security zones are in place. You have firewalls, routers, switches, segmenting those spaces. Now what we can do, using the Dragos platform, is be able to put sensors, between your OT DMZ and your OT environment, the north-south traffic, capture that data, identify what that traffic looks like from a day-to-day basis, and create a baseline of that communication. It's also really important to be able to identify not just north-south traffic, but identify east-west traffic, and be able to look at, VLANs or communities between within your OT environment, how those communicate with each other. Do they go out to field sites? So putting sensors in the proper places to be able to get coverage of the whole IT and OT environment is extremely important. We saw that 61% of our reports submitted last year needed some tweaking or had a lack of OT visibility and monitoring. And, we've been working with our clients to be able to, do demos and get the Dragos platform out there to be able to promote that and get visibility into those spaces. Next up is secure remote access solutions. This is one, as a pen tester, and I think Marissa can attest to it, is dear to our hearts. Testing secure remote access solutions, to be able to see what that looks like in an environment. This number, as we see now, is 29% of our reports, could use some more security around secure remote access solutions. I don't remember the exact number from 2 or 3 years ago, but I believe it was in the 70s percent. And it's really nice to see that number drop over the last couple of years. When COVID hit 4 years ago and everyone was forced to work remotely, plants and operations needed to stay online. Their individuals might be working on site, might be working from home. So organizations need to be able to quickly adapt and be able to identify ways to have folks remote in over the internet to be able to control their operations. So over the course of the years, it's nice to see that this number has gone down as folks have put more thought into their security, remote secure access. One note, as coming from a pen test perspective, is multi-factor authentication is a fantastic way here to not only have someone working at home to log into their IT environment to eventually jump down into their OT space, but also from their IT environment down into the OT side. As a pen tester, multi-factor authentication is a nightmare to get around, and takes a while to be able to do it if you can do it properly. So even that one security control, and we've talked about it a lot over the years, is really nice to be able to see implemented. Excuse me. And the fifth and final security control that we'll break down a little bit later on is risk-based vulnerability management. This is a nice one to have as the fifth one, where all the other four you put in place are, you're happy with it, you're done. Now it's be able to have time to go back and look at your environment to see what vulnerabilities are out there and which one might apply to your environment, right? We talk about a now, next, later approach to, patching an environment or updating machines that might be vulnerable to critical vulnerabilities. It's that mindset that can be taken when we talk about risk-based vulnerability management. A great example that I like to talk about is, I've done pen tests in the past where a client will have Windows XP, Windows 7, Server 2003, Server 2008 machines in their environment, but they VLAN that off in a separate network that's only accessible by certain individuals via MFA or, physically in-person access only, no remote access to it. So that's, to me, an organization that has identified these machines as being critical. There's a wealth of Windows exploits out there that could lead to local privilege escalation or remote access. An organization takes those, segments them properly, and understands that, even though those criticalities might be a 10 on a CVSS score, we can isolate them and those might become a later priority, and we can focus on other machines that we might not know are vulnerable. So it's a really neat way to approach that. And we over the course of 2023, we saw that 41% of our reports, had a lack of that, where asset owners and operators were not completely familiar with their environment and the risks that some certain machines might pose or assets might pose. And again, that's what builds this conversation. So I'll pass it off to Hussain to be able to talk about the point number one, incident response plan, and we'll circle back to this at the end and kind of tie it all together.
Thanks very much, Jackson. So incident response plans, in general, they're really important, but especially for OT, at the very minimum, you need one just because of the differences in technology at large. Now, while most OT incidents do indeed originate from IT, the overall stakes change when you have an IT-based incident versus an OT-based. As we're all aware, IT-based incidents tend to favor the confidentiality and the integrity of data, whereas when you come into an operational technology environment and you're faced with an incident, generally the leading priority tends to be availability. In addition to that, with safety being the first and foremost consideration to take into account in an incident response involving OT at large, the stakes are much higher. So due to this, and due to the OT systems are typically quite intertwined with the physical world, we have to take into account being able to control everything from the machinery inside of a manufacturing plant to things like water station pumps and electrical grid equipment, where necessarily physics are more in play. So what are the four key differences that set OT incident response apart from the more conventional IT-based focuses? First, forensic data collection, which is my bread and butter being a forensic guy. It is different fundamentally in an IT versus an OT environment. With IT, you're generally dealing with data that is not as critical to processes, may not necessarily lead to systems being shut down, whereas operational technology environments, you're thinking about plant turndowns, you're thinking about processes being stopped. In a lot of cases, if processes aren't stopped in a pre-planned, orchestrated manner, you might start to damage equipment and cause ill effect to processes at large. What does this all mean for forensic data collection? We have to be more careful. We have to be studious in the way that we do our collection methods. And so we have to think about the general impact, not only production, but also to people, processes, safety at large. Secondary to that, and it's tied very much to the first, is triaging your forensic data without disrupting anything. Unlike IT, I can't shut down an OT system easily. And due to that, a lot of the air quote riskier forensic practices like collecting memory, for example, which is less severe in an IT environment, needs more consideration, more planning and forethought when you're applying that methodology to an OT environment. Third of all is, of course, visibility. Visibility is a challenge in OT environments. We're not dealing with your conventional protocols that you would find in an IT environment, such as your remote access protocols, your web, your file transfers, so on and so forth. It's using, in some cases, proprietary protocols. It's using technology that may be a little bit more on the exotic side, not necessarily readily seen in nature, which makes running traditional IT forensic tools less effective. A running joke amongst the incident response team is most of us have soldering irons in our IR kits, and that seems like a very strange thing to have. Well, it's because sometimes we have a controller which we may not necessarily have the cable. We may have to do things on the fly. We may have to interpret pinouts. These are all things that you don't necessarily come across in an IT environment. And last but not least, and expertise does matter in OT environments. You have to be mindful of you're working with a technology that might be obscure. There might be process considerations that you have to bear to mind. And you may need specialized network knowledge that may be one unique to the client, but then secondary, you also need to be able to identify things that are marked deviations from the norm or abnormal network activity that might be the first indication of, say, system instability, where you're running a collection or you're taking certain types of evidence off of a certain type of device. And there might be hints of danger or peril that might be lost if you're not familiar intimately with that specific piece of technology. So finally, what are the additional considerations aside from the ones I've already listed? Well, you have to be familiar with taking into account network traffic analysis. Most of the time, yes, host-based analysis is still very much valuable and valued and necessary, really. But then it's also the network traffic analysis that happens in the network itself. So in order to do that, you have to make sure that your environment is configured in order to capture that relevant data. With network forensics in general, it's point-in-time analysis. Sometimes your evidence may be fleeting and may only be present for a very specific period of time. Additionally, extended data collection. You may not be able to collect all your evidence right away. There might be safety considerations taken into account. There might be a system so critical that it can only be accessed or touched during a planned turndown. That will extend the period of time which you're tasked to collect evidence. And not only being skilled in collecting it, but also being able to articulate your challenges and the reasons behind why you may not have all the answers immediately. Third, manual artifact collection. This comes back to my whole example of carrying a soldering iron in my kit. There is manual data collection. You may be making cables, you may be interfacing with JTAG ports, which are a very low level of interacting with hardware. These are all considerations that typically don't manifest themselves in an IT environment. You may also have detection challenges. Sometimes you don't have monitoring capability inside of an environment. That will not only hinder your incident detection, but it will also hinder your escalation in terms of either downgrading, upgrading an incident, being able to articulate why something is important. All these things are challenges inside an OT environment. And then finally, this is more on the people side of things. There is a gap between OT and IT teams. It is based on outlook. It's the method by which these two teams communicate. As I alluded to earlier, there's different priorities. One favors confidentiality and integrity. The other favors usually availability. And so in order to overcome that, things such as clear guidance and playbooks is really, really important. But ultimately, to bring it home with OT incident response in general, you have to have a consequence-driven OT incident response plan. And that means that you have to work cross-functionally across your executives, your IT, your OT, and of course, your other experts, be them third party or otherwise. If you have a confluence of all of these collective expertise, it means that you're going to be much more effective when you're executing the plans, when it really counts the most, meaning in a critical situation. Moving on to my next favorite topic, which is ransomware. So unfortunately, it is my favorite topic, but it's also the #1 most encountered attack in the industrial sector. And so recently, it's increased roughly 50% from last year. Lockbit was seen in 25% of the total amount of industrial ransomware incidents at large, with other threat actors such as Alpha V and Black Basta accounting for roughly 9% or so each. Manufacturing does continue to be the primary target for ransomware at large. It accounted for roughly 71% of ransomware attacks, generally speaking. The majority of ransomware attacks will impact organizations in North America, with approximately 44% of incidents overall, and Europe comes in at second place with roughly 32%. This year, that being 2023, we tracked approximately 50 ransomware variants, which led to approximately a 28% increase over last year. The number of vulnerabilities that we encountered during the course of said investigations were mainly tied to requiring authentication in order to arrive at an exploit, and we saw a rise. So it is a positive trend for OT, incident response, and defenders at large. In 2023, approximately 34% of CVs required some dimension of authentication versus approximately 25% back in 2020. On the other hand, of the 2010 vulnerabilities impacting industrial environments, 14% did contain erroneous information for things like prioritizing risk within IT and OT. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Eddie.
Awesome. Thanks, Hussain.
Always.
So we'll move on to the next of the 5 critical controls, defensible architecture. And Jackson gave us a good overview, but defensible architecture describes features that enable an architecture to be defended, therefore making it defensible. And network segmentation is a key component in that. I'd like to explain what's inside of our 2023 numbers. But first, before I do, some of you who have been following our reports for a few years may have noticed that we changed a bit from 4 broad findings categories to some topics that are a little bit more focused. And the percentages and numbers that we're presenting throughout, both on this slide and throughout the written report, reflect a little bit narrower or explicit view on what qualifies in each of these metrics. But back to the defensible architecture, as Jackson had mentioned earlier, about half, or more precisely 41% of our industrial engagements had a finding that was related to defensible architecture, and network segmentation again was a top constituent of that. From the network segmentation area, roughly 28%, or nearly 1 in 3 engagements had actionable findings associated with them. Some of these, some examples of the network segmentation findings I've got listed at the bottom would include lack of OT DMZ, and this might be where OT networks and enterprise networks are adjacent to one another, but it might also be where we have a DMZ, but it's not being implemented properly and traffic is bypassing it and connecting directly. Domain spanning. This might be where we've got IT and OT sharing the same Active Directory. This has been one of our top criticality findings, or most severely rated findings in 2023. Another example of network segmentation findings would be external connectivity, where the OT hosts are maybe are connecting directly to the internet, or this might even go into external DNS resolvers, which is similar, where OT hosts could resolve external names like Dragos.com on the internet, and that's representative of bidirectional traffic. Safety system segmentation is another thing related to network segmentation, and we've had the past precedent of the Xenotime and Trisis incident from years past that have really highlighted the importance for keeping the OT and safety system separated. So on the screen, I've got 28% of engagements with network segmentation issues. And this particular number is representative of all industries. So this is across all the industries that we assessed. But if we take that number and we decompose it a little bit, we can see that not all of the industries are the same. And of that, manufacturing and transportation stood out as noticeable outliers, with manufacturing here comprised of food and beverage, machinery or parts manufacturing, some chemical or pharma manufacturing, among others. They tended to have more IT and OT networks that were more tightly integrated, sometimes shared management, shared administration, shared services. And this approach seemed to have led to quite a bit more segmentation issues in that space. In fact, we've got shown as 58% of engagements with network segmentation issues in manufacturing, which is roughly twice the all industry average. And when we couple that particular metric with what Hussain had showed us on the last slide, where ransomware, where manufacturing took the top slot in ransomware and roughly 5x in volume, the number 2 slot, we see that there's plenty of opportunities for improvement there, potentially focusing on network segmentation. Transportation, on the other hand, is a naturally distributed network. Transportation, it naturally covers wide areas, and that is the business model. And you can imagine that networks supporting air travel or networks along the railway side lines, or the operation centers that are covering these transportation facilities, don't really have the same structure. They don't have a fence line like you might find at a refinery or a power plant. And when we look through some of the 2023 transportation findings, we find a lot of or higher rate of incidents of external connectivity or DMZ issues within those. And this kind of leads into the next slide, where we'll take a look at external connectivity. So external connectivity findings, they really establish that the external paths exist, which raises the concern for abuse of those. An obvious example might be an operator station that's connected to the internet. In fact, in 2023, we did find quite a few findings labeled OT assets configured with internet access quite directly. But often it is a bit more nuanced. We had quite a few external connection findings related to vendor connections, those raising concerns for supply chain attacks and other things that we have seen in practice in years past. Business system connections like domain spanning, which we talked about a little bit on the last slide as being a difficult finding. And VPN vulnerabilities have also been a talk of recent years. And we found some of those, and that, of course, relates to external connections. So other year in review content has covered some of the incidents related to external connectivity, whether that was political activists, ransomware groups, or threat groups such as VOLTZITE. And these threats are often externally based. Threat groups will seize the opportunities whenever there's some sort of external attack surface that shows up, focused on external connectivity. So this kind of establishes that threat exists. And so when we're working with our clients, we raise these issues, and some of them are known. So when we flag an external connection or something, then sometimes the clients are aware of them, but sometimes they're not. But probably most often they're just not fully understood. And so part of what we try to do is to help explain and understand that the problem exists, and help articulate in a way that it can be approached for remediation. And on the when we're talking about external connectivity, then network traffic analysis. This has been the fastest way for us to come in as outsiders and look at the network and quickly identify those external connections. They tend to stick out pretty well when we use our traffic analysis tools to inspect. And this talk of traffic analysis leads us into the next of the 5 CCs, network ICS network monitoring. So a goal of ICS network monitoring is to enable early detection in the attack lifecycle. We'd like to address the threats proactively and not reactively before any sort of disruption or bad things occur. Network monitoring and host logs, security application events, these are all key aspects of network monitoring that would come up in that discussion. So in our review of the past year, a key point did stand out in that network visibility is critically lacking in industrial settings. Nearly 2/3 of industrial assessments had gaps here, shown by the 61%. And this was, as we saw in the introduction, this was the top of the 5 CCs as far as rate of occurrence. And it might seem convenient for a company in the network monitoring space to highlight this as a gap. However, my experience over the last decades is that security monitoring in the OT space has been completely absent early on, has progressed significantly in the past 5 or 10 years, but still remains an unanswered challenge for many today. So I see this 61% as a bit of a boots on the ground sort of continued confirmation of the need, which has prompted the emergence of solutions such as the Dragos platform. On the right-hand side, I've got some sector observations where we've broken down the 61% to see a little bit of distinctions between the sectors. And again, we find that the sectors are diverse. They're not all the same. And here we've got a wide spread between some of them. And this particular critical control is a bit unique. The industrial visibility or the network visibility technology is relatively newer in the long arc of OT technology as it is. And one way that I might interpret this is to identify which sectors have been motivated, enabled to adapt and are able to evolve to adapt to evolving security practices. And manufacturing here has low visibility and has been seen. We've encountered this twice as often in this particular sector than we've seen in oil and gas, and electrical is falling somewhere in the middle. So with that, I'll pass it over to Marissa.
Thanks, Eddie. So the next critical control on the list is secure remote access. Secure remote access can refer to things like the implementation of MFA paired with a remote access solution, but also the policies and security controls around how remote access is managed, monitored, and audited as part of an organization's overall security strategy. The most common secure remote access findings we had in 2023 dealt with just that. We observed many instances where MFA wasn't required, especially to connect to the OT environment. While there may be MFA implemented to remotely connect to the IT network, assets in the DMZ and the OT environment were home free in the sense that they only required things like user credentials. We also observed that the configuration of these remote connections was insecure. This includes things like lockout and session timeout policies that weren't in place, which is one of the key factors that makes remote service session hijacking possible. As a pen tester, this is one of our favorite ways to pivot between environments. When we see that there's an idle session, but it's still active, I'd say that our heart starts beating a little faster because we can typically take over that session and it goes unnoticed. The other vulnerable remote access configuration is the file transfer restrictions. RDP copy and paste may be an engineer or operator's friend, but it's also the friend of an adversary to bring tools or files in and sensitive data out. Lastly, we have vendor connections, and this one can be really tricky, and we definitely recognize that. Often vendors require organizations to use separate remote access solutions for the specific vendor, adding another factor for security teams to keep tabs on. More often than not, these additional solutions aren't monitored or secured, and they're also configured with permanent access, leaving the door open via third-party connection. Remote access controls like session timeouts and restricting file transfer and implementing MFA increase the security and add strong defense in depth approach to a security program. And as a pen tester, it makes my life very, very difficult. On the right, we have a graph on the percentage of reports with secure remote access findings by industry. So we have wastewater, data centers, oil and gas, chemical and electric. Those are all kind of hovering around less than 30%, which is pretty good. But then we get around to transportation and manufacturing, which are sitting at about 40 or 50% of our reports. And lastly, pulp and paper, which are almost at about 80% of our reports. I'll now pass it to Hussain to talk about risk-based vulnerability.
Thanks very much, Marissa. So risk-based vulnerability kind of ties into the initial of why you need an incident response plan. It's to plan. But then once you've done all your planning, then the next step is to start to look at the ways that a threat actor or adversary could get in. And so in order to prevent adversaries from gaining a foothold and maintaining within your network, it's ultimately really, really important to look at what needs to be remediated from a vulnerability management viewpoint. So in order to prioritize vulnerabilities in OT environments, you need special attention. And that's due to a lot of the reasons which I brought up earlier. It's a unique environment. The risk is different. It really does differ quite a lot from IT systems at large. While on one hand, your IT vulnerability priorities, they'll tend to be determined on things such as business criticality, on your risk severity scores. OT asset managers, they will take additional things into consideration. And most of those will include things such as operational and physical consequences that will result from things such as exploited vulnerabilities. A lot of it ties to, does this vulnerability directly translate into some dimension of downtime? So let's say, for example, you don't patch, but it is behind several compensating controls. That obviously is afforded a lower priority. But where the showstoppers typically start are things that are on your edge perimeter that really do need to be remediated sooner rather than later. If there's a disruption at the outside of your boundary that leads to an incident, generally speaking, it has a ripple effect that could start in your your IT environment and then ripple into your OT environment. Now, unfortunately, that's changing a little bit because OT vulnerabilities are increasing at large. Generally speaking, many standard risk advisories affecting OT systems, don't really convey the same type of mitigation guidance as, say, IT systems. So we also have to be pretty pragmatic when we're looking at certain vulnerabilities in OT environments and really thinking about the impact specifically to you as an operator, to your production, because really at the end of the day, as a plant champion, you're the one that knows the best in your environment. But let's talk a little bit about the 41% that we saw this year that identified vulnerability related issues. So key examples of OT vulnerabilities at large. The first one is a rather large one in the sense that there is no vulnerability management program to speak of. In order to keep vulnerabilities at bay, you really do need a structured approach, and not having a program at large, generally speaking, is obviously the biggest issue. I already spoke a little bit about unpatched perimeter defenses, and I foreshadowed into this point, but really your perimeter devices are your most important, your firewalls, your VPN appliances, so on and so forth. If you don't patch here, like I said before, it will have a ripple effect into your environment at large. The majority of incidents that we've seen at Dragos have in some way, shape, or form had a dimension of an edge device being compromised. And it isn't like, in most cases anyways, a 0 day where you have a relatively short period of time to act against an inbound vulnerability. We're talking about things that could, in theory, be addressed adequately with the luxury of time, but due to awareness or visibility as to what needed to be patched, something fell through the cracks, and therefore an incident was created as a result. Now, third key example of OT vulnerabilities at large, your ICS vulnerabilities. These are the ones which still need to be patched at some point, but kind of fall to the wayside. And we'll go into a bit of detail about that in the next slide, where these are weaknesses in critical control systems, but they're behind several layers of protections and compensating controls. They still do need to be patched at the end of the day. And sometimes when controls are put in place, it is assigned a priority where it may never get touched. But at the end of the day, as a key part of your vulnerability management program, it's being fulsome about things, being complete, and making sure that even though it's a low vulnerability or low priority, it still needs to get addressed at some point. Which brings me to aging vulnerabilities. These are the ones where it's either completely outdated, it isn't adequately maintained, or it's end of life. These are the systems which are remarked about, such as your Windows XP or 2000, your Millennium editions, heaven forbid, but it does happen from time to time. Making sure that you identify and then segment and then monitor those systems with a heightened state of vigilance, because at the end of the day, that is still a portion of your attack surface, and that attack surface does need to be monitored properly. And last but not least, unfortunately, there are certain vulnerabilities, such as, for example, Print Nightmare, which is just about everywhere because it is an integral part of the Windows operating system. Even in this day and age, we still tend to print things. So making sure that you may not be able to compensate for each and every vulnerability, but being aware of them is still key. Knowing what's in your environment to prevent folks like Marissa from, having an easy day at the office is also key. Next slide, please. So we're going to talk a little bit about the overall severity by industry. Now, as you can see, we do have upticks from time to time. The key thing that I want everybody to pay attention to, of course, is the vertical along bottom axis, and then, of course, your percentage of findings. Main thing is that we do see, for the most part anyway, your low and your mediums, and in some cases, your highs. Now, these are assessments that are done as a direct downstream result of identifying your critical crown jewel assets, things that are essential for maintaining industrial processes, machinery, etc. But you have to prioritize these things correctly, and it doesn't always provide a straightforward path to immediate action. One of the things that happens as a result of crown jewel analysis is you have identified the assets which have the highest operational risk if disrupted due to vulnerability remediation. Now, this is kind of tied to the reason why we're seeing a lot of your lows and your mediums, and in some cases your highs, but not so much the criticals. The thing to take away from this is the median line that runs throughout this entire chart. That's kind of the subtle nuance where it's like you have to factor and do a calculus between operational risk, disruption, and then reconcile that against your remediation for vulnerabilities at large. Like I said before, these critical pieces, they're typically protected by robust security controls, and those in the environment will naturally lead to the decision of whether or not and how to address vulnerabilities. It's kind of a nuanced decision. So generally speaking, organizations at large must address things like internal factors such as system connectivity, third-party connections, different vendors, and also just generally speaking, the outside world, if there is, heaven forbid, internet access in an OT environment, which I generally discourage. But additionally, just take the time to understand how the vulnerabilities are being exploited in the wild versus how they would be exploited within your environment. And so taking into account things such as threat intelligence and situational awareness, it plays a really significant role in exactly how you come to the decision of how to effectively prioritize things.
Now, taking a little bit of a different approach to the last couple of slides here, this is not a threat briefing, but we want to talk a little bit about VOLTZITE to set the stage. It's a threat group that Dragos has been tracking since late last year, 2023, and it's important to be able to discuss what their common tactics, techniques, and procedures are, or TTPs, and how they execute their campaigns. They are very good at using living off the land techniques to be able to complete multiple phases of their attack kill chain. This is important to be able to discuss and look at when we talk about this ICS Cyber 5 critical controls. Network visibility and monitoring, is one of them in there. And while threat groups and adversaries or pen testers alike will use custom exploits, custom codes to be able to work through an environment and to avoid detection, putting a lot of R&D and research into their attack chains, they also like to use living off the land techniques, using PowerShell, using command.exe. I don't want to speak for Marissa, but sysinternal tool sets is something that we'll download for every pen test and use a lot of those to be able to conduct our engagements. They're signed by Microsoft, native applications being used in that environment. And, adversaries, they'll use 0 days, custom scripts. They'll use command and control, whether it's, Cobalt Strike or, Covenant, or I don't know. Grizzly Bear is probably one, but there's a whole bunch that are out there that, folks use for different purposes. But the thing that, we've been looking at and the trends is monitoring detection's getting really good for those, and be able to identify what those beacons are doing over what ports. Living off the land allows to use native communications, really against itself. And that's something that, the adversaries are doing. And that's one thing when Dragos pentest team completes their engagements is they focus on using those same tools to be able to mask their traffic and really simulate what's happening with those threats. And it's not just VOLTZITE that's doing it. There's a handful of other groups that use living off the land techniques. Again, it's easier to evade detection. There are ways we can identify it. We can really get down into the logs and be able to identify communications. Does it fall outside that baseline I talked about earlier in network visibility and monitoring? We know what common traffic looks like in an environment. Is there a communication that, like a new RDP connection or a new SMB connection to a machine that we don't have in our baseline that could trigger something to be able to look at that a little bit more? All the hexagons on the right there illustrate the different tactics and techniques that adversaries or threat groups can use to be able to leverage living off the land techniques to complete their objectives.
So much like how we're seeing a rise in living off the land techniques from current threat groups, living off the land is how we approach many of our engagements here at Dragos, especially once we reach the OT networks. Not only is this because AV and EDR capabilities are improving, but also due to the risk of using certain tools in OT environments or the inability to bring tools across network boundaries. Oftentimes, we can find ourselves in situations as well where clients are just hesitant to have specific tools used on sensitive networks, and we meet them where they're at and have to be able to deliver impact scenarios with the only executables and services that are already native to the environment. So based off of our 2023 penetration testing data, these were the top living off the land techniques that our team leveraged. Coming in at the highest percentage was lateral tool transfer, which I'll also combine with ingress tool transfer. Identifying ways not only to laterally move, but also transfer data and artifacts between machines is a critical part of testing. The most popular avenue I would say that we come across is identifying SMB shares that are open across machines, and we can drop artifacts in there to be able to use them on the next machine that we're trying to pivot to. And while engineers and other staff may use these to make life easier for things like maintenance scripts, it also can be incredibly dangerous for that same reason in the wrong hands. We've also come across boilerplate vendor applications of management systems like EMSs, which are also typically come with some sort of network share that customers aren't even aware of. You'll also maybe think that this sounds a lot like that RDP copy and paste remote access vulnerability that I was talking about earlier. Next up, we have OS credential dumping and security accounts manager. I'm grouping these together because we're often looking at the LSAS, which is what we're referring to with OS credential dumping, and the SAM to deliver the same thing, which is password hashes, and sometimes clear text if you're lucky. It's not uncommon to come across outdated Windows operating systems that directly interact with OT assets. This is partly because it's difficult to have downtime, even if it's just scheduled downtime, in order to do updates and patching. Sometimes the operating systems are so old, they don't have the capability for mitigations like credential guard or lapse, which are provided by Microsoft, to protect stored credentials on machines. That makes it one of our primary methods to compromise further accounts and keep moving with hopefully some elevated access. I'll also group PowerShell and command and scripting interpreter together. There is a wealth of native tools that we can use from the command line to perform local, domain, and network reconnaissance. Doing these by hand can be slow, but they often fly under the radar. I think I've only had it happen once or twice where net and LDAP queries were flagged by a SOC as suspicious activity, and I was honestly really impressed in those cases. We also use several TTPs from the command line to perform lateral movement and pivoting, only using tools already available, which I'll talk a little bit more about in the case study. Lastly, we have user execution. And while it's a whopping 1%, it's honestly one of my favorite techniques when we're able to identify this avenue. User execution can be things like modifying startup scripts, scheduled tasks, or even executables that don't have the proper permissions in place. We've got a go-to liner that we use to gain immediate privilege escalation in environments, and it's simple commands that'll execute from the command line in the context of the next elevated user that logs in. So now on the next slide, we'll get into the fun stuff. So often our engagements are a blend of living off the land and third-party tooling. And this is a case study of an attack path where we use predominantly living off the land and also a blend of some tools that ultimately enabled us to traverse from IT to OT, including engineering workstations. Typically, we start our engagements in IT with the goal of traversing to the OT or the DMZ first. I can't say that we're always this lucky, but in this specific case, one of our clients had a machine with IT domain hashes, basically the ntds.dit dump file from the domain controller stored locally from what looked like a previous pen test. That's why it's so important to spend time poking through file systems, because you never know what you're going to find laying around. We were able to transfer this file offline via RDP copy and paste and cross-reference the DAs from that list with the DAs that were still active, which you can do from the command line, to identify if we could pass the hash using these passwords. And if you could guess it, a file that was multiple years old containing DA password hashes had valid passwords. And using, which is now called netexec, previously called crackmapexec, to pass a hash, we could use this account to add ourselves to the DA group. Once we had that access, we started looking at connections down to the DMZ. Leveraging netstat, we found a jump box that was used to pivot from IT to OT over RDP, and it was workgroup based, so our domain credentials would not work. We have two tricks up our sleeve in regards to living off the land RDP hijacking. Using the native command query user, you can see active RDP sessions going out from a device. This output gives you a session ID, which you can then use with tscon.exe, and it's really, really simple. Just take that session ID in tscon.exe, and you can take over somebody's RDP session. Just an important note that this does terminate a user's session, so that is kind of a tell that that happened. But there's another attack that we've started using called RDP Shadow. RDP Shadow is also completely living off the land. You change specific registry keys related to shadowing, and you're able to view another user's RDP session and take control of it without knocking them off. Safe to say we did hear from the SOC after the engineer we targeted started freaking out about his mouse moving across the screen without us touching it. But that is a security win, and we actually called him out in the report for the actions that he took to quickly report that he was seeing some weird stuff going on. When that hijack session popped up, though, we saw that not only were we in the DMZ, but the operator had an additional RDP session open to an engineering workstation that communicates with the process control network. Because of the privileges of this hijacked user, we could add ourselves to the local admin group on that workstation from the command line, as well as to the RDP group, so that we could establish persistence to the DMZ and to the process control network. And it didn't stop there. We also explored avenues for lateral movement in the DMZ using psexec and mimikatz, and the fact that SMB was already open across several devices. We could pass the hash and pivot from one asset to another, and also between zones. Due to our local admin privileges, we could disable AV on machines so that we could use tools like mimikatz without it getting removed. We could also continue to harvest additional credentials in the OT environment via Task Manager, which is that LSS process. And not to mention RDP copy and paste and SMB were our friends all the way down to the process control network when we needed to drop tools. And that is pretty much living off the land for the win.
And to bring everything back to the beginning, right, we talked about, there's been a lot of questions in the chat about, these are the 5 critical controls that I'm working on or I'm seeing. They're all important to be able to go through, be able to work through them again from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 down that list, identify areas of weakness within your environment and be able to assess them internally, have Dragos come in and perform an assessment at either of those levels. The neat thing about the services that we offer at Dragos is that each of the services are able to help in one of these regards, whether it's an incident response service, architecture review, compromise assessment, looking at PCAPs of your environment, being able to identify network architecture, communication flows, and then, you know, going on to a pen test or sophisticated engagement where we're able to actively test those. You know, going back to where Marissa was saying was being able to go through and educate the clients over the course of a week or 2 week long pen test adds tremendous value. You know, architecture reviews are great, organizations do them, and it's a really good way to get your foot in the door and identify those services. Being able to see what an impact would look like in an ICS environment. If a threat group does get to stage 2, what does that look like? Identifying crown jewels in your environment are key when it comes to that. And, you know, the pen testers, they'll go after that when they're actively testing the environment, as long as they're in scope. They don't go out of scope, but that's a separate conversation. So with that, that's the end of the active presentation here, and I just want to thank you all for attending.
Thanks everyone for sharing your insights with us. We don't have a lot of time to take any questions, but luckily our panelists were quick to answer those in the Q&A. And so with that, I think we will wrap it up. So thank you everyone for your time today. Thank you to our speakers. We hope the information that we've shared was helpful. I'd like to invite you all to download the OT Cybersecurity Year in Review report if you've not done so already. And our entire Year in Review webinar series, including the Threat Landscape webinar, our vulnerability briefing, including this webinar, is available on demand. And if you're interested in learning more about the Dragos platform, our expert-led services, or Worldview Threat Intelligence, please reach out using the contact form on our website. And thanks for everything you do to help protect the world's critical infrastructure, and have a great day.